We have Dr. Jules Odendahl James, Dr. Erica Weiberg, Hannah Haverkamp, and Emma Glenn. Sorry, going back and forth there. And they are going to trace the threads that connect the origins of ill-fated lovers Orpheus and Eurydice from Roman and Greek poetry to 17th century opera, feminist poetry, and theater. Dr. Jules Odendahl James is a director and dramaturge whose career focus has been on works by women playwrights, collaborations between artists and scientists, particularly on topics of medicine and the environment, and documentary creative nonfiction media. She has been making theater in the Triangle for over 2 decades at colleges and universities, at the Playmakers Repertory Company, and with independent companies such as Man Bites Dog Theater, Justice Theater Project, and Bulldog Ensemble Theater. Dr. Erica Weiberg is an expert on Greek poetry, especially epic and drama, gender and sexuality and antiquity, and translation studies. In addition to multiple articles on Greek tragedy, Dr. Weiberg has also published on Ovid's Ars Amatoria, Anne Carson's translations of Euripides and Sappho. Yes, okay. Dr. Weiberg's book, Demanding Witness, Women and the Trauma of Homecoming and Greek Tragedy, was recently published by Oxford University Press. In it, she investigates how the trauma of female characters after war is represented and received for Greek tragedies about homecoming. Hannah Haverkamp is a Minnesota-born costume designer and freelance illustrator. She holds an MFA in costume design from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and has worked in regional theater, opera, and independent film. She is currently a lecturing fellow in costume design and construction at Duke and manages the costume shop. Her research interests include the construction of identity through clothing, music, and folklore. Eurydice is her debut design for Duke Theater Studies. More on her work can be found on her website. That's www.hjhaverkamp.com. Emma Glenn is a second-year PhD student in Duke's Department of Classical Studies with a broad interest in both Greek and Latin literature, particularly tragedy and epic poetry. Her areas of focus include the construction of gender in ancient literature, reception studies, translation, and the manifold intersections between these realms. She received her BA in Classics and Comparative Literature from Oberlin College in 2022. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today.
So I constructed the PowerPoint, so I am driving in some respects, but I figure what we'll do is sort of try to talk about origins and then talk about Rules Eurydice, which is the production that's happening, which is opening tomorrow night in Theater Studies as a particular interpretation of the source material, and then talk a little bit about the production that, if you come to see it, tries to pick up some of those threads and where it's drawing its inspirations from. And I have some pictures from last night's dress rehearsal. Please understand they are from my vantage point on my iPhone. They are not the fabulous photographs that were being taken last night because they're just not ready for us today. But that's hopefully what you'll see. So we'll start there with a little bit of the, my goodness. I think I have something, but I'm going to have to insert. This is a quote from Rule's play, and it's one of the things, it's the line I love a lot, is that Eurydice, when she's departing the underworld again, tells her father, "I'll come back to you, I seem to keep dying," which I thought was a great way to start in thinking about how stories kind of come up from whatever we might consider a source or an origin and come around again with their features somewhat changed or emphasized or absented, and also how little or much from any particular source might have actually started with. And I was surprised when I first came to Erica's class and sort of reading some of that source material, how little there is about Eurydice. She's always sort of, when we think about this story, it's Orpheus who rises to the top, which doesn't surprise me, but I thought, oh, well, it's just kind of like it's been left out, but it never really existed as a really deep path of work to begin with. So I love the fact that Eurydice's the sort of character in Rules Play kind of knows and knows that she has this kind of ritualized purpose for other stories. Her loss or her journey it has to happen, but it doesn't get a whole lot of focus and attention. And this, again, as you can see, is sort of like, again, not the best photograph, but it's one of the most iconic images from Rules Play, which is Eurydice arriving in the underworld through an elevator that then rains on her as she's standing in it. And she has the umbrella to sort of hold off the rain, which are sort of multiple layers of water coming into play during the story. And so this is just one of our actors. We will not have rain on stage, just given that, but rain, the water that Rule puts in the play is represented in lots of different manifestations. So we don't have to have rain, which is a lovely thing, but this and there. So I'll let Erica take it away.
Yeah, so I'm teaching a graduate seminar this semester called Rethinking the Past in the Present, which is about how an idea of ancient Greece and Rome has been created and remade in many different cultures and societies all over the world since the classical period. So really thinking about, how our idea of ancient Greece and Rome has been shaped by all of these other cultures' ideas of ancient Greece and Rome over time, through different retellings of mythology and history. And one of the most often used examples of this is, we all have this association with ancient Greece and Roman marble statues, these white marble statues. In fact, those statues would have been painted in antiquity. And so our idea of ancient Greece and Rome is quite different today from what we know about the reality of those cultures. And so we thought it was a good opportunity to pair with Jules's directing of this play, Eurydice, which is a retelling of some ancient sources of a story about Orpheus and Eurydice that we learn about from ancient Roman poets. And we looked at a lot of different retellings of the story over time and what it meant in different cultures. And one of the things I wanted the students to take away from that is that each retelling brings to it its own cultural concerns, its own social concerns. There's always a reason why someone wants to retell the story. It doesn't necessarily have to do with how or why it was retold in the past, but everyone is taking their own culture and concerns and bringing it to their retellings of the play. And that's the case even in antiquity. So even ancient sources, each playwright, each poet was approaching this from their own particular point of view, I guess you could say. So I thought I would let Emma talk a little bit about some of the ancient sources and maybe the story of Orpheus and Eurydice and what we know about that.
Yeah, so to start out, probably our first full and proper account that still survives today, although it was probably even older, of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice comes from the 1st century BC poet Virgil, writing in Rome. And you may know him from his more popular work, the Aeneid, but he includes the story of Orpheus and Eurydice in the end of this poem called the Georgics, which is about mostly farming, but also about trying to create a peaceful sort of state of Rome after decades of civil war. And he tells the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, where then these two lovers, Eurydice on their wedding day dies because she's being pursued by another man trying to attack her. And Orpheus goes down to the underworld. His song, he's a musician, is powerful enough to, move rocks and stones. And he asks the king and queen of the underworld for Eurydice back. They say, sure, but you can't look at her. We don't ever get a reason why he can't look at her until they leave the underworld. And while they're walking up to the upper world, he gets seized by, they say, a sudden madness in the Latin. And he suddenly turns around, and Eurydice says, hey, why did you do that? I'm going to die again now. And then she disappears. And so this is really a story about the power of love and music, but also the fallibility of humankind to be seized by these sudden emotions. Or perhaps divine intervention. They like that a lot in the ancient world. And then about a century later, the other most famous version, more like a few decades later, of this story comes from Ovid and his Metamorphoses. And this is also nested within an extremely long narrative about the history of the world as they saw it. And in this narrative, Orpheus, goes down to the underworld to receive his wife who's also died. He gives kind of a pretty lame speech or song about why he should get his wife back, basically saying, I'm just borrowing her. She's going to come back eventually. And love exists in the underworld too. I mean, Hades, you kidnapped your wife, and you're still married. And then on the way back up to the upper world, he suddenly gets scared that she's going to disappear, turns around, she disappears, all she says is goodbye. And then Orpheus spends the rest of this book of poetry that is nested within other books telling stories about how terrible women are. So sort of like a guy who went through a bad breakup and then decides that that's every woman's fault. So those are our real, very different ancient sources, and I'll turn it back over. It was pretty long.
Yeah. So one of the things you'll notice from Emma's retelling of these stories is that we don't learn a lot about how Eurydice felt about any of this, right? And so what happens, especially in, I would say, feminist retellings of this story, is they're really interested in exploring, you know, what would that story have been like from Eurydice's perspective.
I mean, these are paintings largely from early 1800s to mid 1800s, and you'll notice there's a pretty, you know, we're sticking with the themes that we know, or the position that either that Orpheus is leading Eurydice out, or when he turns around, she is lost to him. And this sort of follows that story. I was trying to go back to that. Even in the mosaic, which is sort of, it's just in the center, she's always behind him. She's always sort of appealing to him, and he's the active figure in that. Her active figure is almost in her disappearance. And I think that that's something, what I love about Rule's retelling of it is the idea that to give Eurydice an opportunity to explore what really transpired in that interaction between the two of them when he came for her. And I don't know sort of how much spoiler alert there is. The play is not necessarily built intensely on plot, because there's not a lot of plot. There's sort of like three things that happen. They meet, or they're getting married, she dies, however we decide that happens, he goes down to the underworld, and then the event happens that leaves her in the underworld. So the premise for Rule is how would Eurydice actually kind of manufacture her own interest in staying in the underworld? And to that end, she creates a new character, which is her father, Eurydice's father, who has been in the underworld before her, which mirrors Rule's own father's death when she was in college, about 20 years old, I think it was. So her father died of cancer. And in the attempt to, I think, sort of grapple with the notion of grief and what the underworld sort of space, given its presence and the idea of when you die, where do you go? What is your existence? And what sort of management the Greeks had of that kind of story. The idea that her father would be there and prevent himself somehow from forgetting her, which is usually the role, is when you're there, is to be wiped clean of that longing for a life that you cannot have anymore. So he has protected himself, and partly to wait for her. And then when she comes, she doesn't remember him, and part of the second act of the play is recultivating that relationship and giving her a stake to then stay in this space with him. So the whole idea being that Eurydice, if given a choice or given action, might actually choose to do something. It's not necessarily Orpheus's fault or sudden madness that she disappears. She actually makes the choice to go. And I'll leave that at the spoiler alert, because it doesn't quite end the way anybody anticipates, particularly the Eurydice. Did you want to say anything? I mean, again, we've been talking a lot in our discussions, and at Duke, just so you know, the main stage production for the theater studies department is actually a class. So that, in some sense, to give performers and crew members who give a lot of their time over the semester academic credit for that work, but part of it is also spending some time dramaturgically thinking about why we would do Eurydice in this particular moment in time, why we would do it on a college campus with college-age actors, beyond the fact that it is at sort of the core about young love, but then it is a play that introduces an older figure in there, and that's very essential to have this parental experience. What does that do to the story? And then also to just think about the larger concepts that we're dealing with. One, love and romance, and how that's made, and then when you lose somebody who you had a lot of a deep affection for, whether by sort of sudden aspects or you have a bad breakup, but also the idea of what is it like to be in an active stage of forgetting, to operate in a world where your memory or your capacity for memory is not the same as other people around you. And that's from everything from, oh, we went there, Hannah, don't you remember that story? And you're like, no, I have no idea. Oh, wait, or that wasn't me, that was somebody else, or just literally not being able to grab on to the memory in and of itself. What is it like to operate in relationship with that sort of thing? Because that is kind of the part of the second act of the play, is Eurydice learning to behave in the underworld, but also learning to rediscover her father, who is trying to help her, but his memory is not so great either, because he's been dipped in the river of forgetting. So he's hung on to little bits and pieces. So the two of them trying to communicate over that gap. And what does it mean to not recognize, and not just people, but things? So you'll see there's a whole motif of Eurydice interacting with objects that she doesn't quite remember how to use, or how to make them function in the way that you might expect. Is there anything? I mean, I don't want to sort of skip ahead, but any more in that sort of notion of memory that?
I mean, I think it's striking that it's such a big part of rules play, because it's not really emphasized in many other, either the ancient tellings or many other retellings of the story. And it strikes me she's really interested in this idea of like how memory can be quite cruel in a way, if you're like remembering something that is painful for you. At the same time, forgetting can also be quite cruel, and especially as Eurydice at first in the underworld doesn't recognize her father at all. He has to rebuild for her these memories of their family, and so you kind of see it both sides of the coin, and it's interesting that becomes kind of the central act of this play, the primary concern, I guess, of rule.
It also seems interesting to me that I think it's kind of essential to Rule's treatment of this. If her versions of these characters are on some level aware that they are part of an endless cycle of this story being told over and over again, that memory and the loss thereof has to be an essential component of that.
I would say, I mean, it's sort of maybe insider baseball sort of information, but when we started the production, I actually had cast 2 actors to share the role of Eurydice actively on stage in the play. And part of that was because I feel like there's a strong strain in the play of her consciousness of, that happened and I remember it, and then there's a sort of version or an active part of her that's just everything's brand new. And I've never seen it before, and it's entirely discovery within that. And so that didn't actually manifest in the production, but we do have 2 actors playing that, and they are changing off nights of performance. And some of what they're carrying from the rehearsal that we did do with both of them on stage together, sort of dividing up the lines, dividing a little bit up of the blocking, was that they as actors now have 2 kind of very different but joined senses of Eurydice in the play. And that's really only marked in a difference in staging at the very beginning. But it comes back to that notion of how much, one, that's a character that even if it's very minimal, the script is very poetic in its rendering. There's not a lot of dialogue. There's a whole lot of stage directions, and there's a lot of things for actors to do. But even within that, for as absent in the source material as Eurydice is, as present as she is, she's very rich, and there's lots of stuff for an actor to kind of put their teeth into in terms of why, what is this relationship with father, what does it mean for Orpheus to come back, and then Orpheus, the sort of men of Eurydice, which are Orpheus, obviously, her father, and then Hades, who shows up in a couple of different guises. How does her relationship with them over different times in the play start to impact what choices that she might make? I wanted to move just quickly to some of the inspirations for the set. One of the things that Rule, who is writing this play 2003 to 2006, so it's almost 20 years old in it, and she herself sort of looks back at a couple of time periods, cites them specifically, of the 50s and the 30s. We were also trying to think in the way that you always have when you teach at an undergraduate institution. We go, 50 years ago, that was like 1970. It feels, what was my notion of a nostalgic sort of era when I was in college is now a good deal different than the students who are now. So thinking about what is also their referent point, perhaps, which is not the 50s and 30s, which would be about 40 years ago at the time that someone is an undergraduate, but then now the 70s and 80s. So we were also looking at the 80s as another moment, as most historical both design elements and references to the classic or the ancient world come back, is the 80s also had a kind of a view on that as well. So the scenic designer was very taken with some of those, and you can see at least at the bottom, these statuette heads that are done in the kind of neon. And then the way that too, this kind of circular pattern, we really wanted to make curves a very present sort of space in the show itself. Sarah C. has this amazing installation called Fallen Sky, and you can see it sort of in the gallery and then also where it's installed permanently, but a kind of crumbling of that, which feels very responsive to how we sort of receive classical world in kind of fragments. And then we also had the notion of where and how would we have an upper world and an underworld, where Rule is also very specific that the stage doesn't change. Like, we don't leave the same Act 1, and when we go to the underworld, it is in Act 2, we don't leave the setting that we've established within that. And the scenic designer and I had worked on another play that in and of itself went across about a 50-year span of a relationship, and the actors never left stage, and it had to be all different times all at once. We did a lot with light. And so this was the kind of ultimate rendering that was there. There's a little bit of a nod to a made-up kind of version of a classical Greek language there that's painted and embedded on the set. There's a lot of marbling, or at least the impression of that. And a lot of curves, which are definitely, they look really easy on a SketchUp design. They're very difficult to manage in practicality in a scenic way. And this is obviously the rendering on the left, and then this is, again, my shot from last night of, we got pretty close to what is actually on the stage. And the decision that we weren't going to have water, even though water, the feature of the raining elevator is sort of like a thing that you say Sarah Rule to a theater person, that is sort of an image that comes up as a way to then, because water appears in so many different ways, that we weren't necessarily having to be tied to the specificity of the material there. Though you will hear water in almost all of the sound, so it is a very prominent, the way that calls up any kind of memory that we might have in relationship to the feeling of being, of just having water running in the background, a grotto, the storms, things that kind of come up naturally in relationship to that. Hannah, you want to talk about making people make sense in this world?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, there are some challenges with this script because it has these appeals to memory and nostalgia. And Sarah Rule is very bossy in her stage directions. She's very specific. But as a designer, I'm always like, okay, but why though? I would like, I respect that you want it to be like this, but I want to understand what the gist of it is, what the point of it is. And so in collaboration with talking with Jules and talking to the scenic designer, and creating this this world of kind of juxtapositions. When you've got an overworld and an underworld, you want to create visual language that makes it as clear as possible, both for the audience, but also for the actors who are going on that journey. So, in an appeal to nostalgia, we very much have father existing in this almost archetypal, like Leave It to Beaver dad space. He's very almost like a caricature of a father, because there's this idea that perhaps Eurydice lost him when she was quite young. So this is in the event that this is all kind of, is it a real underworld? Is he crafted out of her memories and her sort of fantasy version of a father? In many ways, he's sort of archetypically perfect. And so we let him have this very cozy, very comforting, old-fashioned fatherly look. Orpheus is, we wanted him to be a sort of cool but approachable musician type. I think we got there.
We got there.
Yeah, we ended up casting a boy with the absolute sweetest face possible, and so giving him any kind of like rock and roll edge felt very silly. So
He's also a member of one of the a cappella groups in there, and I think that they also kind of exist in this space of kind of a campus cool, but then they know all the show tunes, right? So you can kind of
100%.
move in those spaces together. And
Yes.
thank God for David Byrne, who sort of became
Yes.
a visual reference of that, of course, a long career, but one that is sort of like, you know, sort of persona of effortlessness, of kind of, I'm just cool and I don't care, you know?
Yeah.
And that Orpheus had a little bit of that as either an aspiration, or he just sort of commandeered that when he engaged people.
Yeah, he has this kind of this sort of quirkiness combined with a slightly Buddy Holly aesthetic that I think we arrived at. I was really pleased with. And then Eurydice herself goes on quite a journey. Obviously, she's the point of the show. One of the hardest things to figure out was, is she moving toward a very specific version of herself, or is she shedding all of other people's stories that have been projected onto her? And we ended up going more with the latter. She has a lot of very specific costume pieces that sort of go over a base that refer to her role as a wife, as an incoming bride for Hades, as like this sort of perfect woman. And then as she forgets and as she spends time with her father, she's allowed to kind of get comfortable and let her hair down and simplify and simplify and simplify until she is left, and our driving sense of the character is coming almost 100% from the actor herself, and the costume is telling us almost nothing.
Mm-hmm.
She becomes a blank page for the actor herself to write on. And then
I think it's a little hard to tell here.
Yeah.
I think I might have an image of it later, but in, again, the idea of not having water, because again, there are some practical concerns to that, but I think there's also, you know, like having actors be fully immersed in a water bath or being rained upon within it. We also wanted these things about being taken on and off, that they are elements, plot, you know, so they're purpose of the plot. They are narrative devices as opposed to the reality of individuals. So father, when he dies, I think you can see the little inset there. There's a piece of him that becomes sort of part of this underworld vocabulary that we have, and when we see the stones, that'll make even more sense. Eurydice, too, has a shroud that she puts on as a sort of covering of the water that's got the writing that's also in this, in the set in and of itself, which is a created language, right? We can't go back to whatever reality was, and there was never a reality. There's the story that gets told over and over again. So this, too, are sort of like compilations of ways to represent how she is written upon, or this final writing of herself into dipping herself in the river, which is the second death, right? The way where she only will have memory of the place that she's at, which is the underworld. This just is a little bit more about how brilliant Hannah is with this, not just the painting of the rendering, but then this is the actor sort of in these costume pieces in and of himself with brand new hair.
Yes.
Yes.
And took pictures of Cary Grant to the barber.
It's always good.
Yeah, so here's a little bit of the process for Hades. So he has to go through these. He appears the same actor as essentially 3 different versions of this same sinister figure. First as the nasty, interesting man who sort of abducts Eurydice or lures her back to his elegant high-rise apartment with the promise of a letter. And then immediately tries to make the moves on her. So we really wanted him to be this sort of like gross 1980s coke-fueled businessman.
Thank you, Wall Street, for
Yes.
a really nice historical reference.
Just
on
a
that one.
real sleazeball. But there's so much reference in the script to a man with big shoulders who can take care of you. A man with broad shoulders. And so I was like, well, this writes itself, like, obviously. But then he returns after she has died. He returns as the Lord of the Underworld, but as a child. So there's this creepy disconnect between his very mature and kind of sexual dialogue juxtaposed against he's in the script written entering on a trike. So we ended up giving him this kind of like evil Mickey Mouse aesthetic and a cardboard crown. But you'll see within him and with the stones later, I wanted all of the denizens of the underworld to have moments of pleading as part of their costumes, both to evoke the fluting of Roman columns, but also to suggest the water and sort of juxtapose the fluidity of water with the rigidity of the columns and the rigidity of the rules of the underworld, which the stones enforce.
Those are fabulous leather pleated shorts with the suspenders, which are just they are rather magnificent. But again, back to all the when color appears as a really sort of bold color choice within that. Again, against a perception of this kind of purity marbling or stuff like that. But I mean, if you look up close, and again, the scenic painters have been painting into the wee hours of the night for both the texturing on the floor. That is all done hand painted. Nothing bought, nothing screen printed. That is all human hand. But really thinking about almost to affect the water, which I noticed, as I always do as a director, like, oh, that's really cool. The frame around the door, when there's projection of lights on the backdrop of the curtain, the whole thing looks like water. The marble looks like water as well, which again was a conscious choice by the scenic painter.
All right, and the stones, these are probably the most, there's a lot of Buck Wild costume choices. I don't pretend most of this is normal, but these ones are particularly a strong choice, I would say. But one that ended up really feeling as though it fit in this kind of bizarro world that we created. We wanted the stones to be both human, able to move. They couldn't actually be just like built into the set with face holes, which is, I have seen that done, but they needed to blend into the set. And so I thought about both a literal camouflage, having them be this marble texture with this broken down alphabet on them, because the underworld is where language kind of goes to die. But also of, who are the people who fade into the background, who are the people who end up getting anonymized, and who your eye glazes over, and it's oftentimes service workers or custodial staff. And so these boiler suits really felt like a natural choice to have the stones represent this kind of post-mortem collective identity, but with these little moments of personality that that I think they're really leaning into, mostly represented by these big sort of steel and aluminum rigs that are intended to evoke a lot of the aesthetics of the set, the wire and light bulbs on the set.
They each get a particular adjective. They're big, no, little, large, and loud. But also one of the ways that trying to think about that as an actor might approach it, that sort of like, what do you think of me? You're loud. But with it, that both the part of that descriptor was belonged to the things that they would wear, not that they were inherently one or the other of these things. Mm-hmm. And also that loudstone, who can be loud, but the idea of volume is also about taking up space. So interestingly, loudstone is almost large, sometimes larger than largestone, just in the way that she fills the space. So it gave them a lot of opportunity to really think about how language might reside in the body and how they come together in the sort of conventional Greek chorus way. It sort of feels like if you're going to invoke Orpheus and Eurydice and you don't have a chorus, we're not sure what we're doing here. But that they have some individuality in each one of what they're doing. I think that is there.
They were a lot of fun.
They are, and they're having. Again sort of thinking about. At one point in time, we played with the notion that they would change off, and each time we saw them, one would be little, one would be big, one would be, like they would maneuver that around. I think it's become much more satisfying for them to have these additional costume pieces that they can really sort of inhabit, especially Loud has these heads that are sort of like, one is really over her shoulder, and there's every once in a while I saw the actors just sort of like looking at, like, I have friends, so there's a bigger chorus than the chorus, so that they can really, giving them a lot of time to play in those spaces has been really helpful.
That's awesome. I didn't notice she was
Oh,
doing
yeah.
that. God bless.
It was one that was sort of leaning over one night, and I was like, I think your head is dipping. She goes, oh yeah, I have to, pull it up with my friend.
That's awesome. Yeah, I wanted Loud to be represented by these sort of howling mouths. It's kind of the closest any of this gets to, Souls in Torment. But
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and they're around and they play, and we've also made a specific choice with how they cry, because the big moment is when Orpheus sings the song that is so sad, which in the script, it says that his music is there and he is singing, but no words come out of his mouth. So again, this is the playwright who I think is very specific about when and how music is used, how Orpheus is seen as the musician. And then that also gives us then a lot of freedom to figure out what is crying. Is it a physical? I didn't put it up there, but we also gave each scene, and there are many of them. There's 3 acts, but it's only a 90-minute play, so it runs without an intermission. But each scene, and there are like 20 of them in Act 2, they're like a page long or half a page long. We gave each one an action verb. And so we have things like to crumble or to lure. And those became a way that, partly because the scenes are kind of small groups of people, they're either pairs or the stones are there with Eurydice herself. Everyone, that action could be part of what everybody was doing. That was sort of giving us a sense of why that scene was there, or what was sort of what was giving that scene momentum. Within that, and we sat around and came up with those based on, after a couple of weeks of rehearsal, to do that. And the one with Orpheus is, for the stones, it is to crumble, and they had a great time thinking of what the physicality of that, because again, it's all done. We have Brittany Green, who's a PhD student in composition, really lucky to have her as a collaborator, wrote Orpheus's theme, and we hear it in a couple times. He does sing, because the actor has a lovely voice, so we're like, whoa. Just one moment of it, and then it'll come back over and over and over again, and then in that piece, you won't quite hear the full part until the curtain call, because Rule is very specific, I think, about sort of giving Orpheus his presence as the sort of musician par excellence, but not one, not making a requirement for that actor to have to sing in a particular kind of way or with a particular skill, but also that the music is what we conjure of it almost. It's available to us in snippets and parts, as opposed to returning him to prominence because he would sing so well. That's the part of the story that comes up over and over and over again. And for this to center on Eurydice, it actually, in the text, there's a lot of debate over what's the best art form. Is it language? Is it those things? And music can be both, but the sort of notion of orchestral or instrumental music versus poetry and spoken word, and the debate there, I think, which is kind of at the core of what Rule is, and as a playwright, who then also there's a version of this play that was made into an opera in 2020, and played at the Met, and had two Orpheuses, I think, one who sang and one who didn't, to really extend that prominence. So Orpheus has really belonged to the musical canon more than Eurydice, I think, has belonged to the theatrical canon until this play.
Yeah, I remember hearing that about the Met Opera thing, and I was like, that is a fascinating choice to give him all of that airtime in a show called Eurydice. That was wild.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you all found in the adaptations that you've seen too, there's a lot of opera loves him, right?
Opera loves
Orfeo is
Yeah.
beautiful.
Which is kind of a bold move, to try to conjure music so powerful that animals and stones will come and listen to it. But you can see why it was catnip for people putting on operas, because they want to conjure that idea, the power of music.
It's like the ultimate challenge.
Yeah, and in many of these early operas, they even made Orpheus succeed in bringing her back. So they were really invested in this idea of music having the power to bring people back to life.
Yeah.
Musicians' wish fulfillment.
Yes.
Well, and we've had that too, that especially thinking about women writers, there's a lot of attachment to Rule, particularly because this is a biographical story. She's writing about her father. She dedicates the play to her father. Father has a long passage of directions to a place as he's starting to dip himself in the river again, and those are actually directions to their childhood home. So, in fact, the stage manager's like, you can look it up on Google. I was like, okay. The specificity with that, but allowing her as a playwright to also play those other characters. And we were talking a little bit about Orpheus, because it's very easy, I think, in my career as a director and as a feminist, I would sort of say, well, she's still very kind of conforming to heteronormative ideals, and even though it's putting her at the center. But there's a moment too where I sort of like reminding myself to remind the actors that she is also Orpheus. And part of the prominence of Orpheus's, like his art, his approach to art, was equally as available to her as a playwright. And I think that those are things we tend to attach sort of automatically to sort of like the man is either inside the consciousness of all of the characters or above it. And when a woman writes, then it's obviously sort of attached to only the women that are in there. Mm-hmm. And I think Orpheus, it's sort of Rule having an internal debate, and the fact that she would put a book together for an opera libretto also makes me go, yeah, there is that sort of like, what is this the ultimate kind of art? Is this the ultimate kind of art? As an artist, how do I show up if what I do is write, this kind of, or this is the work that other people do with my words or my presentation. Yeah. So giving her that space in Orpheus's journey, as much as sort of thinking about her being very much attached to Eurydice, was a sort of moment that we're kind of like, oh wait, yeah, we need to be thinking a little bit, or a more reminder to myself of how the playwright is playing all of these characters all at once. I think we're about at time to take any questions. Is that right?
Thank you. As I wait for anybody in the room to ask questions, I'm monitoring online as well. I do have a question. How would the play have turned if you were able, so you mentioned a character at the beginning where you had talked about two people playing him. How do you think that would have changed what it ended up looking like?
What I realized as we got to the end of Act 2, in the final integration of that, I was going to have to make probably more interventions into the script than I would be allowed without having a conversation with Sarah Rule about, is this okay?
Okay.
Partly because the choices that Eurydice makes around staying or going, and the whole sort of outplay with Orpheus, with two people intervening with that, it just became much more. They'd have to be more collaborative within that space and the stage. So it just wasn't. I mean, there's lots of tweaks and things that go. I feel like, especially in the space of an academic, I want to also like, yes, let's experiment, and yes, let us also remember what copyright is for, and this is not, But I do think she, as a playwright, she gave an interview to American Theater about the 20th anniversary of this, and she's just been, even though the stage directions are really specific, and sometimes it's like, you feel a little hemmed in, she's been very, all kinds of ways that the stones have been represented, whether there's water or not on the stage. So she's not policing the boundaries of that, but I think that choice might have been, and I was inspired by her choice to have the two Orpheuses.
Yeah.
I thought, okay, there's room for that there. It did help. I think the rehearsal process was also really wonderfully open for really exploring the kind of depth that character can give, or at least you ask the two actors who will play Eurydice off and on whether that felt like, and the other actors had an opportunity to find different ways to play scenes because their scene partners were changing. And again, it's an academic theater program. It's also giving them chops to think about how that works in a professional setting, or just that you're always going to have to be listening. And if that person, if you get too stuck in something because you all know each other really well, the fact that you have a different actor to respond to is going to up your game for that performance.
Thank you. Anybody in the yes? Okay.
I'm not super sure if this is a little bit distracting for what you are talking about right now, but I'm very interested in Dr. Weiberg's course, Rethinking the Past in the Present, because I'm actually teaching a very similar course right now about Chinese mythology and legends. I think there are two kind of broad questions that I have. One is linking to kind of inquiry in the discipline of history to ask why mythology is still important in today's realm, because we have that long history to discuss already. Why should we talk about something that's quote unquote unreal? And the other question is more like a pedagogy question that I'm encountering also in class, which is how to keep students interested in something that, yeah, it is being reinvented all the time, like adapted and then retold all the time. But then at the same time, we have, again, for students who have so many things they want to care about, why should they study something about mythology and legends? So those are some of the kind of existential questions that I have while teaching this particular course, but I'm also curious how you will react to that, and also if other panelists have thoughts, I would love to hear as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and I would love to talk with you more about your course because it sounds fascinating as well. So the course this course is for graduate students, and so I think they come to it with a little different background and interest than undergrads, but I also teach an ancient myth class that tries to maybe do some of the same things that you're doing with your class with mainly Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek and Roman myths. And one of the things we struggle with in that class is, the students want there to be like one version of the story that they can learn, right? But one of the defining features of myth is that it's something that is not, there's no authorized or single version, right? This is a live tradition that in antiquity and today is retold over and over again by different people for different reasons, right? And so one of the things we do is think a bit about how, like, why was this myth told in this place at that time? And in the case of Orpheus and Eurydice as a story, it's been told in many different places, in many different times for many different reasons. And so it gives us a good kind of through line for the graduate seminar to talk about a lot of different cultural moments when it became important. And we're constantly asking this question, like, why this version of this myth at this time, right? Like, what about the cultural context made the people who created this want to tell this story? And maybe I can ask Emma to speak a little bit about that and how that's played out. Yeah.
That's It's a really interesting question, I think. I mean, and that's why we keep asking it every class period, why this myth at this time? And I don't know, I think that that's a way to keep so many people with, because everyone in that class has, I think, very different interests involved. Everyone will bring their own sort of backgrounds and what they know about a particular time period and what was going on into that particular setting. Like, I think some of our, had some really interesting conversations about Black Orpheus, the film, and what was going on with, you know, a lot of different things, and, you know, thinkers in Europe sort of responding to Black thinkers who were starting to write about racism and to write poetry in the face of and against colonialism, and how that really played into, or perhaps how that was interacting with Black Orpheus at the time, because that is a film that received a lot of pushback. It was made by a French man who was criticized for sort of presenting a romanticized and very simplified version of Brazil and of the lives of people there. So I think that's just one example of the really interesting dialogue that we can have about what's going on in a particular place, in a particular cultural moment, with all of these different people creating different kinds of art that is all related to this myth.
Yeah. Yeah, so, you know, we really lean into the complexity of it and kind of try to resist that, like, urge to, you know, pin down an authoritative version of a myth. And I think that's actually what people love about myth, too. So, yeah.
I would say that that sort of dramaturgical question is also about season selection, right? Why? Why this play? Why now? Why in this context? And there's a lot of, I think, Rule actually kind of aggregates a number of representations of that, because Brazilian samba shows up for no particular reason. There's also Train that's referenced. There are absolutely a sort of series of Black Orpheuses, you know, sort of like inside the world that she's building, consciously or unconsciously. And then just to say, like, why do it here for an undergraduate acting group? You know, it's a classical play. We did 12th Night in the fall. I think it's like our water season in some regard, because that's the shipwreck, right? Notion of, you know,
Women being transformed
women
through
being
water.
transformed right, through love, or within that, reuniting of family members, sort of thing. So again, whether you go in with the season to say, these are all the resonances right there, or once you choose them, it's sort of like, okay, so now how and why across different spaces are these, and how do you help the students come to that? Because it is, I think, the curricular component. What's nice about having a performance is, yes, you can take something from beginning, middle to end, but then they have the opportunity to see it within the season for the student, within the season for the department, but also other classes that might be of interest to them, that they're going to carry a little nugget of this experience into that other. So text always in conversation with other texts.
So we have one more question for you guys. If you have time afterwards, if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to stay. But
Thank you so much. I'm Elizabeth. I'm a 7th-year doctoral student in art history, and visual studies. And this play looks amazing, so I hope to come and see it. And wonderful job, all of you. If I may, and if we run out of time, totally fine. But I have a question for this side of the room, I think, and then that side of the room. The comment, Dr. Weiberg, about, you know, we have this idea about classical antiquity being primarily white, because as we see the statues, they're pristine white, but we know because of amazing scholarship that that's not actually accurate. And thinking about the paintings that were included in the slideshow of kind of a representation of the play that repeats that kind of whiteness, right? So those, I think, are 18th century probably. So I guess my question is, in the two texts, the Ovid and the other person that you were saying, Emma, there is absolutely no, I mean, that was so far be it for our conception of race or whatever, but there was no idea of the person's skin color in these myths or stories at all. Is that?
Well, there's some interesting, the way they thought about race was, of course, very different, but there's an interesting point in the Ovid where after Orpheus and in the Virgil, where after Orpheus rejects all other women after Eurydice, her second death, he then goes and is torn apart, sort of limb from limb, by a group of Thracian women who are spurned by him. And this idea of Thrace as being, which is a region in northern Greece, as being correct? Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. As being very foreign and kind of other, in a way that I don't know if we would want to draw any kind of direct comparison. That would be very difficult to do, but there's this idea of ethnic otherness, definitely, that kind of plays a role in this play. And I think that's very complicated and maybe understudied aspect of this. But sorry if I interrupted you.
No, that was actually, and I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, and ideas, so modern and ancient ideas of race don't map onto each other, like Emma was saying. In that example, it's not about skin color per se, but about all sorts of other cultural ideas about, how language and cultural practices affect who a group is. But I will say, in the 19th century, when we have emerging this idea of race surrounding the transatlantic slave trade, that's the same period when some art historians were wanting to make the case that these ancient Greek and Roman statues were white, and to enforce this idea that Europe is the inheritor of Greece and Rome, and that Greece and Rome are white. And so one of the things our class does is kind of look at moments like that and show how that's reflected in the way that they're thinking about ancient Greece and Rome, how they're using it in their art and in opera and plays, right, to create this sense of white supremacy or Western supremacism. And our purpose, in the class is to kind of critique that, to call attention to that and critique that, and show how it's quite different from how the ancients were thinking about race, and at the same time not minimize the fact that they too had, even though different ideas about race, they too created this sense of othering and an in-group and an out-group.
Yes,
So, a complex topic, but
Can I ask okay, really quickly, just because when we first started the conversation, it was brought up that Eurydice is so, her presence, her voice is so absent in the previous myths. And just wondering, and maybe it's just the fact of that rule this is a really biographical play, but the fact that she inserted another male figure, and maybe this is and maybe there's not much there to it, but just thinking about if that is a criticism of the myth, but yeah, so maybe it's just an answer of this is really biographical, it's really a personal, for some reason she really looked to that myth, liked it, and then wanted to insert another male figure into it.
I mean, I think it's hard not to see Eurydice's, the creation of a father that then she returns to, as not sort of reproducing, in some respect, the same heteronormative, the thing that she is either taken from or punished for. I'm not, depending on how we see the nasty, interesting man. But yeah, I mean, I think that is the biographical, maybe playing greater role in the purpose of the writing of the play than receiving it. I think now is the question of sort of how do we make all of those characters, particularly Eurydice, the fullest human being that we can, given the limitations of the text, which I think is that's the challenge to the actor and challenge to that moment again of why do it again, right? It has become a kind of canonical play by a woman, and so that is a benefit to it, but then to also ask those questions as much of her as we would of any other playwright that is going to carry some limitations of their vision into the piece.
So I want to thank you again for coming to the Franklin Center today. And if anybody has anything they want to ask afterwards, please feel free to pop up here. Otherwise, thank you again and welcome. Thank you.